Modern music begins with the Velvets, and the implications and influence of what they did seem to go on forever. There are a few artists that can claim a similar level of influence and praise as the seminal New York City rock band, the Velvet Underground. Not many rock groups have maintained relevance quite like the Velvets have, a band heralded for simultaneously being groundbreaking but also misunderstood and overlooked during their brief time together. And while all of their music was interesting and daring, it's their debut record that remains their highest achievement. The Velvet Underground Nico is often considered one of American music's most significant records, sparking the light for countless artists that have followed it since its release in 1967. The Velvet's particular blend of avant-garde music, ice-cool New York street smarts, and blood-pumping rock and roll is still an intense, vital, and enduring work of art. The stories of the album's creation and the songs within are some of the most compelling, bittersweet, stupid, maddening, and sometimes hilarious in rock history. It's worth mentioning that the stories behind the record and the Velvet Underground themselves are drenched in inaccuracies, contradictions, over-embellishments, and excessive over-romanticizing. Honestly, the only thing we really know for sure is what's on the record itself, and I've even got some questions about that. Like Lester Bangs once said, "I've always believed that rock and roll comes down to myth. There are no facts."
You're my Coney Island baby, so much to me. You're my...
Born in Brooklyn in 1942, Lou Reed grew up in a quiet Jewish household in Long Island in a fairly typical suburban environment. His childhood was marred by mental health issues, however. He suffered from panic attacks and mood swings that ultimately led his parents, on a suggestion from their doctor, to have Reed endure electroshock therapy. Reed eventually claimed that the electroshock therapy did long-lasting psychological damage to him, which put a lifelong strain on his relationship with his parents, one that seemingly never recovered. It's sometimes claimed that Reed was actually put under this torture as a form of aversion therapy to cure him of his bisexuality, but his sister denies that their parents would have done something like that and were just ill-advised by their doctor in the hopes of helping their son. He was somewhat antisocial in his school days and developed an intense love of music, particularly rock, R&B, doo-wop, and jazz. During this time, Reed formed his first band, the Jades, a three-piece doo-wop group, and recorded a single for their song, So Blue, in 1958.
Walked down to your house last night, see if you were home. Found out that you'd gone out, and I was all alone. So blue, so blue, so blue.
Reed started college at NYU before quickly transferring to Syracuse, where he continued his love of music by running a radio program centered on avant-garde jazz music from the likes of Cecil Taylor and John Coltrane. His second love was literature, with a special fixation on the underground anti-conformity beatnik movement. Reed was highly influenced by the immediate gritty realism of writers like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Hubert Selby Jr. He was enamored with their ability to write upfront, confrontational stories about taboo subjects like drugs and sex. While in college, Reed would experiment with putting together his love of literature and rock and roll in ways no one had prior. That's why, in a sense, it was so easy to do. It was like uncharted waters, which made it so absurd to be told they were doing something shocking, with Howl and Naked Lunch and Last Exit to Brooklyn already out. There was such a narrow-minded view of what a song could be.
So blue, so blue, so blue. I'm always crying over you. So blue, so blue.
John Cale, born only 1 week after Lou Reed on March 9, 1942, grew up in the rural, conservative lands of Wales. He played the piano from a very young age, before discovering the viola by chance. The local grammar school, the local authority buys them a bunch of instruments so they can have the school orchestra. When I came around to look for something, all of them were gone except for the viola. Cale, much like Reed, quickly developed an obsession with music and began formal classical training in London, finding interest in the avant-garde scene amongst composers like John Cage. In 1963, he traveled to Massachusetts on a Leonard Bernstein scholarship before moving to New York City soon after. Cale worked on several avant-garde excursions here, including playing as a part of a live performance of Eric Satte's Vexations, a 19-hour marathon piano piece alongside several other pianists, including John Cage. Cale eventually hooked up with the most prominent avant-garde musician of early 60s New York, Lamont Young, to perform in his underground ensemble, the Theater of Eternal Music. Lamont Young is an important figure in the avant-garde scene of the 20th century, and a vital piece of the eventual development of the Velvet Underground's musical identity. Young, working off his eclectic well of influences including Igor Stravinsky, Anton Webern, organum, gamelan, Japanese, and Indian classical music, was paving his way into furthering his unique type of drone music, which has influenced countless musicians, including, of course, John Cale. Playing viola with Young, his wife and fellow artist Marian Zazila, friend Tony Conrad, and a few others, Cale would maintain a sustained drone consisting of different notes for an hour and a half every day for a year and a half. This is also around the time when Cale and Tony Conrad began experimenting with electronic pickups and wiring up guitar strings onto a viola, which Cale recalls producing a drone that sounded like a jet engine. That was my first group experience, and what an experience it was. It was so different. The tapes are art objects. Some people who came to our concerts knew what it was like, but it's the only example of that kind of music in the world. While Cale was playing his drone music with Lamont Young, Reed moved to New York City to secure a job at the other end of the musical spectrum, as a songwriter for Pickwick International Records. Here, Reed worked as a poor man's Carole King, quickly and cheaply producing knockoff pop songs, capitalizing on whatever current fads were happening at the time. This job, while not creatively fulfilling, paid the bills and gave Reed some vital experience. There were 4 of us literally locked in a room writing songs. Then we'd go down into the studio for an hour or two and cut 3 or 4 albums really quickly, which came in handy later because I knew my way around a studio. Not really well enough, but I could work really fast. While most of the music Reed worked on at Pickwick is pretty basic, one song in particular is actually vital to the formation of the Velvet Underground.
Okay, I want everybody to settle down now. We got some new we're gonna show you, man. It's gonna knock you dead when we come upside your head. You get ready? You said here we go, yeah. All right, come on. All right, everybody get down on your face, man.
Allegedly, Reed heard that ostrich feathers were going to be a big fashion trend later in the year, and decided to capitalize on it for a potential hit song. Of course, Reed's take on a dance craze was anything but conventional. Lyrically, the ostrich is a bit at odds with other dance crazes, consisting of laying your head on the ground and having someone stamp on it. It's also notable for its siren-like introduction, and the so-called ostrich tuning, where every string on the guitar is tuned to the same note. Terry Phillips, a producer at Pickwick Studios, thought the ostrich might be a potential hit, and quickly worked to promote the single, setting up a tour with the Primitives, the band credited for recording it. The Primitives wasn't a real band, though, just a fake name crafted to go along with the song, a tactic often employed by Pickwick to give their makeshift singles more credibility. To remedy this, Phillips enlisted John Cale, Tony Conrad, and their friend and sculptor Walter de Maria to become the Primitives' backing band. This is finally where Lou Reed and John Cale make their first acquaintance.
Hey, go, go, go! Hey, come on, baby, move your muscles, man.
Initially, Cale was surprised by Reed's ostrich tuning, since it was coincidentally similar to the sort of thing he was doing in the Theater of Eternal Music. The Primitives played the ostrich around for a few weeks, at parties and possibly a few local variety shows before quickly fading into obscurity, but the spark between Cale and Reed had been ignited. Reed eventually convinced Cale to listen to a few of the songs he'd written, although he initially wrote them off as uninspiring folk tunes. I missed the point because I hated folk songs, and it was not until he forced me to read the lyrics that I realized these were not Joan Baez songs. He was writing about things other people weren't. These lyrics were literate, well-expressed, tough, novelistic impressions of life. Cale realized there was not only artistic potential in these songs, but a commercial prospect in combining Reed's rock and roll background with his avant-garde work with Lamont Young, and finally, the pair's creative partnership fully begins. The Velvet Underground are often identified as a quintessentially New York band, a label most often associated with their debut record and the lineup that produced it. The role the city plays in the band's story is significant. A decent reminder of the turbulent times New York City was going through in the mid-60s is Cale and Reed's own song, Prominent Men, an early composition they recorded a demo for in 1965. It's a rare Velvet Underground political anthem about the unjust balance of power, possibly inspired by Bob Dylan, another New York resident who was making his own headway changing modern music at the same time. But while it may be out of the ordinary for Reed and folk hater John Cale, it helps to contextualize the environment the two were living under in the mid-60s. While these avant-garde bohemians were getting their creative footing, New York City was going through a reconfiguration. Folk singers, painters, actors, and poets were all taking advantage of the cheap rent in the areas surrounding the Lower East Side and Greenwich Village, transforming these parts of the city into hotbeds for artistic creativity in meeting spaces like poetry cafes and music clubs. At the same time, hundreds of manufacturing companies were leaving the city, leading to a steady economic decline, which would eventually lead to near bankruptcy in the mid-70s. The city was facing a list of problems that was quickly piling up. Racism, segregation, civil unrest, protests, riots, a growing drug epidemic, and so many more. Cale and Reed were only two of many artists who were injecting the grit, blood, and steel of the city to make ambitious works of art that reflected the chaos that surrounded them. This and so much more was the socio-economic funk that Cale and Reed began their partnership under to eventually birth the Velvet Underground.
Prominent men tell prominent stories. Prominent men tell prominent lies. Prominent men kiss the ass of Dame Fortune. The prominent men will tear out your eyes.
Soon after the flop of The Ostrich, Cale convinced Reed to move in with him at his loft on Ludlow Street. They began practicing primitive versions of Reed's songs, recording them onto a demo tape that they would shop around for a record contract. To round out their sound, they enlisted fellow avant-garde scene associate and drummer Angus McLeese. McLeese had played with Cale and Lamont Young previously, and had a highly eccentric and Eastern-influenced style that brought a distinct edge to Reed's songs. Soon after, while on the train, Reed ran into Sterling Morrison, an old friend he'd played rock and roll with back in Syracuse. Reed invited him to join the band as an additional guitarist, completing the essential four-piece of a rock and roll group. Morrison, a lifelong rock and roll devotee, brought along a bare-bones, no-nonsense approach to guitar, as well as another nihilistic and strong-minded personality. It's around this time that the group solidified their name. They'd actually been workshopping a few ideas, narrowing down between either calling themselves the Warlocks or the Falling Spikes, possibly a sly reference to Heroin. The four quickly adopted a different, much more fitting title when, and this is an account where there's some direct dispute, either Tony Conrad or Angus McLeese found an abandoned copy of a novel titled The Velvet Underground, a forgotten sensationalist tale detailing the underbelly of sexual deviancy, like orgies, homosexuality, and sadomasochism. Sterling Morrison bluntly described the story as a really boring novel about wife-swapping in the suburbs. They found the name fitting, since they'd already considered themselves amongst the underground art scene in New York, and to a lesser degree because the book extolled the sexual corruption of our age. The Velvet Underground began their first public performances, playing accompaniment to various avant-garde film screenings, from filmmakers like Piero Helscher, Barbara Rubin, and Andy Warhol. Soon they would form a casual managerial relationship with Al Aronowitz, a highly connected rock journalist who seemed to know everyone from Bob Dylan and the Beatles to Jack Kerouac. Aronowitz saw the band's potential and began seeking out more high-profile gigs. Their first official paid gig is still one of the most infamous pieces of the Velvet Underground story, the concert at New Jersey's Summit High School. They were booked to open for the middle class for $75. An immediate monkey wrench was thrown in once Angus McLeese, who thought money destroyed artistic intent, quit after learning that the band would be selling out by making money. He was also notoriously unreliable and would show up to rehearsals at his leisure, often never arriving when he said he would. Reed theorized that this might have caused McLeese to get cold feet, that he couldn't stomach the idea of finally having to start and end at a predetermined time. Either way, the band needed a new drummer. On a whim, Reed remembered an old friend of his and Morrison's had a sister who played drums. Mo Tucker's own band had recently broken up, and she'd already met Reed a few times previously. At the time, these were good enough reasons to enlist her, at least for 1 or 2 gigs. She also had an amplifier and could use her parents' car to transport gear, which didn't hurt. It's amusing in hindsight how flippant the choice to hire Tucker was, since it would end up being one of their most significant decisions. Her basic no-frills approach was completely different than what was normal in rock music at the time. She was largely influenced by the drumming of Nigerian legend Babatunde Olatunji, who had found success in the West only half a decade earlier. Tucker, like Reed and Morrison, was also a childhood fan of rock and roll, citing the straight-edge, technically strict playing of Rolling Stones drummer Charlie Watts as a favorite. She rarely employed the use of hi-hats or cymbals, mainly relying on a lower tom drum while playing upright. Her concise, consistent drumming style gave the rest of the band room to improvise and expand their sound in ways no other drummer could. She was also just a decent, kind-hearted person, and would often cool down the friction that could simmer between the rest of the band from time to time. With a new drummer locked, the Velvets performed one of their most infamous shows. It's not really a surprise that their music went down poorly at a high school in 1965. Some claim that half the audience ran screaming out of the room as they pounded through their 3-song set of There She Goes Again, Venus and Furs, and Heroin. Morrison recalled Aronowitz saying the group had an oddly stimulating and polarizing effect on audiences. Of course, the middle class were pissed that the Velvets had ruined the show before they even went on. I tried to apologize to the lead singer, but secretly I was exhilarated, says Cale. Once we had started, I was sure nobody could stop us, because we knew exactly what we were doing, and we were very good at it. About that, I had no doubt. Soon after, the Sonic Terrorists were booked as the house band for the Café Bazaar, a dimly lit tourist trap in Greenwich Village. Similar to the fateful meeting over throwaway single The Ostrich, the Café Bazaar would prove to be another unexpected miracle.
We're sponsoring a new band. It's called the Velvet Underground.
The stint at the Café Bazaar is a good summation of what it was like for the band in the pre-Warhol days. They hated it there, often playing to small crowds of tourists or drunks that were either indifferent or actively hostile to their music. Clearly, the Velvets were not a good fit for a poetry club house band. Luckily, this part of their story would be cut abruptly. It's one of rock music's perfect alignments that led Andy Warhol to meet the Velvet Underground in late 1965. It is actually possible that Warhol had already heard the band during one of their performances at Avant-Garde cinemas earlier in the year, of which the Velvets even backed some of Warhol's own films. But it wouldn't be until Warhol's visit to the Café Bazaar that the professional relationship would officially pop off. Warhol was, of course, already a famous artist by 1965. His pop art style and mysterious persona had made him a high-profile figure in the New York art scene. But he'd recently decided he was tired of painting and wanted to move on to different art forms, particularly filmmaking. Paul Morrissey, a filmmaker who had recently began collaborating with Warhol, who had little to no technical movie experience, claims that the idea to get into the music business was his, and that Warhol was initially reluctant. Morrissey eventually convinced him that music management was a potentially lucrative venture and set out seeking potential acts before being tipped off by underground filmmaker Barbara Rubin of a local undiscovered group. In late December, Warhol, Morrissey, Rubin, and Gerard Malanga, another Warhol associate, went to the Café Bazaar to see if the Velvets would be a good fit. Their strange avant-garde style instantly clicked with Warhol, and he and Morrissey asked the foursome to come under their wing, an offer the budding rock stars eagerly grabbed. The timing of this meeting was actually lucky, since the Velvets were fired from their residency at the Café Bazaar only a few days later. Apparently the club owner, after hearing them perform their classic Black Angel's Death Song, made it clear he hated the song so much that he would throw them out if they played it again. Looking for a quick way to get out of this shit gig, the Velvets promptly replayed the song, got thrown out, and never played the Café Bazaar again. Reed tells the story a bit differently, saying a group of rowdy drunks were actually the ones who hated the tune and caused a scene after the band played it a second time. Either way, the Velvets were onto bigger, more tinfoil-y things, as almost overnight the band found themselves rehearsing in Warhol's factory, his infamous art studio and hangout spot for his posse of weirdo New York bohemians. Nobody normal would go to the factory, said Cale. It was a protective environment for kooks, quite dangerous for your sanity. The factory ended up being a perfect fit. although the more straight edge of the group, like Mo and Sterling's girlfriend and future wife Martha, found some of the scene to be so intimidating that they would sometimes hide in the bathroom for extended periods. I don't think we would have been anything without the fascination Warhol created, says Cale. By being attached to someone with Warhol's notoriety and attention, they instantly gained some credibility, but also some of the intense critical fixation he garnered. Morrison put it bluntly. We gained all of his enemies. The people who thought he was a faker thought we were fakes. Soon the Velvets would be greeted by another oddball seeking Warhol's path to stardom. The Velvets' new manager decided the band was missing a vital element: sex appeal. The problem is these people have no singer, Morrissey recalls telling Warhol. There's a guy who sings, but he's got no personality, and nobody pays the slightest attention to him. They need somebody with a bit of charisma. Luckily, German model and actress Nico had just arrived in New York with hopes to build up her music career. Nico had made a bit of a name for herself already. She was familiar with many in the music industry like Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones, and publicly was probably most recognized for a short but memorable role in Federico Fellini's La Dolce Vita. Warhol and Morrissey instantly saw her potential as a singer and sex symbol for their musical ambitions, and invited her to join the Velvets. The band was not keen on this forced addition. To me, she was just a pain in the ass, Tucker bluntly put years later. The Velvets said she had no place in their four-piece, although they accepted her at Warhol and Morrissey's insistence. It didn't help that they felt they only had a few songs that fit her particular singing style, and the only instrument that she could play was the tambourine.
Now I may not be alone each time I see, or show up when I promised that I would.
I do think the gamble to add Nico paid off in the long run, even if her contributions to the band were minimal. She added this weird, mysterious aura to this formation of the Velvet Underground that only adds to the larger myth of their legacy. Her living dead, depressive attitude nestled in nicely with the band's nihilistic, black leather-clad public persona, and her own singular cultural influence is also significant. Nico was a new type of female superstar. Baby Jane and Edie were both outgoing, American, social, bright, excited, chatty, whereas Nico was weird and untalkative. You'd ask her something and she'd maybe answer you 5 minutes later. When people described her, they used words like memento mori and macabre. She wasn't the type to get up on a table and dance, the way Edie or Jane might. She'd rather hide under the table than dance on top of it. She was mysterious and European, a real moon goddess type.
I can say I'll always do the things you want me to. I'm not saying I'll be true, but I try.
We all knew something revolutionary was happening. We just felt it. Things couldn't look this strange and new without some barrier being broken. An essential component to the Velvet Underground's development and notoriety was their involvement in Warhol's exploding plastic inevitable. The EPI was an ambitious, sensory-overloading, absurd multimedia extravaganza, which worked to unify the Velvet Underground's music, Warhol and Morrissey's cinema, light shows, and the provocative dance performances of Gerard Malanga and Mary Woronov. The EPI shows were chaotic and overstimulating, aiming to assault its audiences as much as entertain them. We just played and everything raged about us, without any control on our part. The event was the first real light show ever given with a rock and roll group, Morrissey reflected. We had 5 motion picture projectors with 5 pieces of film, much of the footage we'd shot in the past year, running on top of their performance and reflected on the screen behind them. There were also 5 slide projectors showing patterns of pink, green, and blue polka dots and things, just enhancing the kinetic effect of the movie projectors. It was the first time anybody had seen a strobe light put not just on the stage, but on the dancers. Plus there was a mirror ball from old dance halls. Critics were simultaneously dumbfounded, disgusted, and exhilarated by the EPI. Variety described it as a 3-ring psychosis that assaults the senses with the sights and sounds of the total environmental syndrome, and called the Velvets' music extremely interesting. Chicago Daily News called it a non-stop horror show. The flowers of evil are in full bloom with the EPI. Let's hope it's killed before it spreads. The New York World Journal Tribune called it a secret marriage between Bob Dylan and the Marquis de Sade. The first shows were held at the Dom, a club in the East Village, a quiet part of town mostly home to Polish immigrants. These first performances were successful from the very beginning, with opening night drawing 750 people, giving the Velvets the best exposure of their career, even if most in attendance were more interested in Warhol than the music. "We actually sold more records than people would lead you to believe," Morrison said. "The first week we played with the band, we made like $18,000. It was all in cash, and it was all in paper bags, so I went from $5 a day to $15 a day. I just didn't know what to do with all that money. But then we went to California and spent it all. When we were there, we cut quite a figure."
Pop goes Andy Warhol's Plastic Inevitable show at the Trip starting tonight. You'll flip at the Velvet Underground, and Nico, the Incredible Light Show, and Andy's fabulous underground movies. Better not miss a bit.
After several successful shows, they decided to take it on the road, performing in places like Ann Arbor, Michigan, before heading out west for an extended tour in California, starting with a highly anticipated stint in LA. The first California shows were said to be attended by many prestigious members of the West Coast music scene, including Cass Elliot, David Crosby, and Cher, who infamously walked out. "It depressed me. It will replace nothing, except maybe suicide." This is really where the EPI and the Velvet string of good luck began to run out. These New York speed freaks were out of their element in California. Warhol and the Velvets, with their black monotone outfits, sunglasses, and amphetamines, were a far cry from the naturalistic liberation of the hippie movement, and were met with hostility and ambivalence. "What was annoying," says Morrison, "among so many other things about flower power, was the way taking psychedelics was intellectualized as being mind-expanding or somehow insightful, as though all those stupid hippies were on a spiritual quest instead of just taking drugs. It wasn't a question for us of seeing something as something else, but of seeing what it was in fact." Critics over here were just as exalted or disturbed by the shows, if not more so than their East Coast counterparts. Ralph J. Gleason, future founding editor of Rolling Stone, reviewed the show for the San Francisco Chronicle, calling it all very campy and very Greenwich Village sick. "If this is what America's waiting for, we are all going to die of boredom, because this is a celebration of silliness of cafe society, way out in left field, instead of far out, and joyless." The Los Angeles Times was more optimistic. "Not since the Titanic ran into the iceberg has there been such a collision as when Andy Warhol's exploding Plastic Inevitable burst upon the audiences. For once a happening really happened, and it took Warhol to come out from New York to show how it's done." Any reception was cut short, though, as the LA police shut down the EPI on its third night. The police saw the shows as putting on a pornographic exhibition, according to Cale, although it might have just been shut down due to suspected drug use. The EPI did continue to tour in cities like San Francisco, but they were starting to lose steam. Mary Warrenoff claimed that their stint in California damaged the group's morale. Negative reception, setbacks, and an overarching aura of failure seemed to follow them around, and by the time they returned to New York City, everyone seemed disillusioned. Another gut punch was the loss of the original nightclub, the Dom. The club's manager, who had agreed to a contract with Warhol to give him full reign of the club, reneged their agreement, selling out to Albert Grossman, Bob Dylan's manager, for $300,000. Years later, Morrison, still bitter, claimed the Dom was stolen by criminals, calling Albert Grossman's company a criminal syndicate. Warhol actually contradicted this narrative years later in 1979. "We wanted to get out of the Dom anyway. We didn't want a nightclub. It was too hard. We could have gotten it back, but we weren't happy there. We could have found some other place, and we did. We started another place called the Gymnasium." Unfortunately, there's little footage or audio of the EPI, leaving an important document of the Velvet Underground story somewhat lost to time. The EPI's influence has mostly been obscured too. For its time, its ambitious idea to incorporate multimedia elements into one unified rock performance was fairly unique. It was a show by and for freaks, of which there had turned out to be many more than anyone had suspected, who finally had a place to go where they wouldn't be hassled, and where they could have a good time. The EPI was also an instigator for the next chapter of the Velvet story. After pooling together some of their earnings, they finally decided it was time to cut a record. The The Banana album was recorded quickly and cheaply, somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000, at the Scepter Record Studios on 54th Street. Norman Dolph, an associate of Warhol's, helped finance and record the record, recalling spending 4 days in the studio laying out the bulk of its material. At this point, the Velvets actually still didn't have a record deal, but they decided to start recording anyways, to at least have something to possibly entice labels to sign them. The Velvet Underground and Nico's sound is notable for its ruggedness and imperfection. Much of the music is packed under distortion, mic bleed, and a general lack of know-how. Part of this is from the unideal recording environment much of it was produced in. Cale noted the low quality of the Scepter studio. We went in there and found that the floorboards were torn up, the walls were out, there were only 4 mics working. Martha Morrison, then Sterling's girlfriend, claimed she had to hold Tucker's drums for her to keep them from wiggling around. Dolph, who enlisted recording engineer John Licata to help, was far from an experienced producer. Cale even claimed he didn't understand the first thing about recording. I was not the producer in any sense that Quincy Jones is a producer. I kept the thing on the rails. I think part of the way the record sounds the way it sounds is because of John and I keeping the damn thing moving. I don't think there's 2 different complete takes of more than 1 or 2 songs, and I'm not even sure the breakdowns were saved. Because we were paying for the tape at probably $125 a roll, usually the broken takes were backed up and recorded over. While the recordings were perhaps rudimentary, Cale says the sessions were exhilarating. We were really excited. We had this opportunity to do something revolutionary, to combine the avant-garde and rock and roll, to do something symphonic. No matter how borderline destructive everything was, there was a real excitement there for all of us. We just started playing and held it to the wall. I mean, we had a good time. They also did some recording at TTG Studios in Hollywood, about a month later during the California tour. This time, they gained the experienced and illustrious producer Tom Wilson, who had recorded with jazz legends like Sun Ra and Cecil Taylor before dabbling into the folk rock scene with artists like Simon and Garfunkel and Bob Dylan. Wilson was kind of a perfect match for the Velvets. He was one of the few who saw the potential in them early on, and wanted to sign them to his new rock label Verve, which also housed the Mothers of Invention. Wilson was mostly interested in Nico, with Morrissey recalling Wilson telling him, "I can't put any of this on the radio, but the girl is fantastic. She could be a big star, and I'll sign the group just to have Nico." While the details are a bit murky, the Velvets spent their California studio time re-recording some of the tracks they laid down in New York. They touched up a few more, and produced one final new song, finishing the set that will eventually be released as their debut record. Let's also not forget the record's official producer. It would be a mistake to picture Warhol behind the soundboard fiddling with knobs and dials. John Cale claims he had next to no creative input, and Paul Morrissey says he only showed up to the studio maybe once or twice. This doesn't mean he had no impact at all, though. His role was seemingly one of a morale booster and paternalistic protector. The advantage of having Andy Warhol as a producer was that because he was Andy Warhol, they left everything in its pure state. And so right at the beginning we discovered what it was like to be in the studio and record things our way, and essentially have total freedom. Whether Warhol had much to do with the album or not, the Velvets having full creative control over their vision was vitally important, and ultimately led to the creation of something truly one of a kind. Of course, Warhol did design the cover art too. Even today, it's one of the most provocative and eye-catching album covers. Perfect in its pop art simplicity. Peel slowly and see, it says, and indeed you can peel off the yellow banana sticker to reveal the phallic pink banana flesh underneath. This maybe not so subtle sexual illusion is a perfect accompaniment to the Velvets' various tales of sex and drugs. It might also be a reference to a rumor that smoking banana peels could potentially get you high, but I don't think this has ever been commented on. And while the cover by itself is great, its minimalism possibly added to the confusion as to what the heck the record actually was, especially considering the band's name appears nowhere on the front. Nowadays, of course, it's one of Warhol's most famous works, and another bridge that will forever tie him to this era of the band's history. Sunday Morning is a perfect album opener. It lulls you into this journey on a sensitive, pillowy, and, for the Velvet Underground, unexpected note. It contradicts their stereotype as scary avant-garde rockers, known for pissing off audiences with loud, confrontational, guitar-led rock. The song stemmed from Tom Wilson's worry that the album didn't have a commercial enough song to promote as a single. He also feared the record didn't feature Nico enough, so he convinced Reed to write a radio-friendly song that Nico could sing lead on. Reed and Cale, who received co-writing credit, began working on what would soon become Sunday Morning, taking a suggestion from Warhol to write a song about paranoia. In proper Reed fashion, when time came to record the track, he wouldn't let Nico sing, perhaps in the hopes that he'd get more of a spotlight singing on the band's lead single, which didn't even end up charting anyways. Wilson's production experience is felt fully on this track, complete with Reed's soft, echoey vocals and an orchestral light arrangement full of subtle touches, like Nico's distant background vocals and a feather-like piano flourish. Ironically, the song mirrors the kind of LA pop that the Velvets detested. The Celeste, which opens the track, despite being a perfect addition to the tune, was added by chance. Apparently it just happened to be in the corner of the studio, sitting out from a previous session, when Cale decided to use it then and there. It enhances the song wonderfully, starting off the record with a lovely tone that separates it from everything that comes next. Reed's lyrics are at odds with the sunshine, however. Paranoia is the key word here. Reed pictures a world that conspires against you, warning you of your inevitable downfall.
Watch out, the world's behind you. There's always someone around you who will call. It's nothing at all.
The combination of smooth, ethereal dream pop juxtaposed with Reed's cloying, anxious storytelling is the perfect VU paradox. Nothing here can be taken at face value. Hope is supplanted by fear. The light of tomorrow carries something sinister, even if it appears welcoming. Cale's drone work helps subconsciously reinforce this idea. Underneath Reed's tender voice, the heaven-like warmth of the Celeste, and the lullabies of Nico's backing vocals, is a constant through-line that nags on the back of your mind that never fully goes away. Sunday Morning is proof of the Velvets' commercial leanings right from the get-go. They had a special ability to create compelling pop songs alongside their usual brand of avant-garde rock and roll. Their ability to switch instantly from one lane to the other added complexity to their artwork, providing an endless juxtaposition of textures, sounds, and attitudes. Perhaps the best example of the Velvets' unique brand of tonal juxtaposition is Between Sunday Morning and its follow-up. Finally, here's the Velvet Underground in all their proto-punk black sunglasses glory. The iconic underground heroes of debauchery, the grungy, androgynous, long-haired miscreant cavemen, stopping and smashing their instruments into a seductive assault of bone-rattling feedback. A wake-up call after the hypnotism of Sunday Morning, almost as if this is a different band entirely. Reed trades his paranoid sensitivity for the monotone beatnik coolness he's most famous for. Cale bashes his fists into his piano keys, railing out in unrelenting boogie like an even more perverted Little Richard. Tucker slaps her drum into a singular pulsating rhythm with lightning focus. Morrison's rhythm guitar barely sounds like music, about the jankiest distortion you'll ever hear. Cale's bass line is one of my all-time favorites. John was trying to be a serious young composer. He had no background in rock music, which was terrific. He knew no cliches. You listen to his bass lines, he didn't know any of the usual riffs, it was totally eccentric. Waiting for the Man was very weird. John was always exciting to work with.
I'm waiting for my man. $26 in my hand. Up to Lexington, 125. Feel sick and dirty, more dead than alive. I'm waiting for my man.
The end product here highlights the main thesis behind the Velvet Underground. A unique melding of influences. A bit avant-garde, a bit rock and roll, all rolled up into one dissonant attack of monotonous rhythmic noise. As the song reaches the end, Cale wails an even grittier and more dissonant chord, melding with Morrison's tin can guitar into a droning coupling of distortion. These are some of Reed's best lyrics as well, a great display of his primary literary inspirations. Here he channels the gritty directness of the beatnik era, fixing a light on a subject largely avoided in rock music, that being a visit to Harlem to score drugs.
He comes, he's all dressed in black. He wore shoes and a big straw hat. He's never early, he's always late. First thing you learn is that you always gotta wait. I'm waiting for my man. All working out.
His cold journalistic storytelling is matter-of-fact, amoralistic, and emotionally severed. Reed drags us along for the ride, providing us with a short but memorable exposé on the life of a junkie. He fixates on details, like the attire of his dealer, the money he grips in his hand, painting a picture that opens your mind up without drawing out too much or injecting commentary or editorializing. He's not here to tell you how to feel, but to simply expose you to a taboo that many would prefer remain in the dark. Reed rolls out some shockingly frank lyrics for rock music of the day. He replaces suggestion or metaphors with direct realism. Aligning the poetry of his beatnik idols and the thumping backbeat of his youth, Reed recontextualizes both. The track closes with a soft reality check, a subtle acknowledgement of the potentially grim future in store for his protagonist.
I'm feeling good, I'm feeling so fine. Into tomorrow, but that's just some other time. I'm waiting for my man.
Reed allows us to imagine what's in store instead of spelling it out, giving you something to linger on as the song fades out. Of course, I'm Waiting for the Man is easily one of the Velvet's best songs, and one of Reed's finest lyrical achievements. But now it's time for another singer to take the stage.
That's all right.
More tonal whiplash, Femme Fatale is Nico's debut. Another pretty track, more overtly sexual to Sunday morning sweetness, though. Gone is the feverish intensity of I'm Waiting for the Man. Moe's drumming is still bare bones, but just played a bit softer. The tambourine shakes with less obsessive fervor. The guitar is produced with more grace, no longer drowned out by clipping feedback. Nico introduces some new life to the band's sound, expressing grief, ecstasy, and smugness as she croons. She supplies a playfulness that Reed was maybe less suited for. She was also apparently irritated at how the band pronounced Femme Fatale, saying it should be Femme Fatale. The band was unmoved by her correction, though, with Morrison telling her, "It's my title, I'll pronounce it my way." The song's inspiration is said to have been instigated by Warhol, particularly his infamous association with the ultimate 60s New York it girl, Edie Sedgwick.
I'd like to turn the whole world on just for a moment. Just for a moment.
Here she comes. You better watch your step. She's gone to break your heart in two. It's true.
At the peak of Sedgwick and Warhol's relationship, Edie was on top of the world, synonymous with the turbulent youth-centric obsessions of the mid-60s. Warhol suggested that Reed write a song about Edie, even referring to her as a femme fatale, and there are indeed a few parallels between Sedgwick and Reed's subject. While the song's femme fatale displays calculated domination over the men of her life, Sedgwick was decidedly less in control. She struggled with various substance addictions, and suffered from eating and mental disorders throughout much of her life. Mirroring how Reed's character chews up and spits out men, Sedgwick was similarly used and abused by the people in her own life, consumed by the vanity and celebrity that engulfed her.
Little boy, she's from the street. Before you start, you're already beat. She's gone to play you for a fool. Yes, it's true, 'cause everybody knows. She's looked and paid the things she does to please. She's just a little tease. See the way she walks, hear the way she talks.
Femme Fatale actually might not be about Sedgwick at all. Cale claimed it might be about her, but speculated that it was probably inspired by the starlets that were around doing screen tests for Warhol at the factory. The girls were all mad and strung out on drugs, beautiful and wasted. Warhol was making Chelsea girls when we rehearsed, and that was harrowing. You'd see the girls disintegrating and sliding down the walls with tears in their eyes. Reed once cryptically explained that Femme Fatale is about someone who was one and has since been committed to an institution for being one, and will one day open up a school to train others. The song then feels even more like a tragedy, a tale of cyclical abuse, moving from one unwitting victim to the next. Of course, there's also the illusions of the femme fatales of classic Hollywood noir. One of Reed's biggest literary idols was Raymond Chandler, the legendary novelist of many noirs, including The Big Sleep, and co-writer of classic screenplays like Double Indemnity and Strangers on a Train. Reed's character closely resembles the cliché of this classic film trope, a dark, mysterious, often villainous woman who seduces and manipulates men in order to use them for personal gain. Whether a Hollywood damsel, New York socialite, or Warhol superstar, Femme Fatale works beautifully as a complex tale of love, manipulation, and eventual sorrow.
Shiny, shiny boots of leather with plash girl child in the dark.
The 1965 Ludlow Street demo of Venus in Furs is the best example of the stratospheric jump that was made in the year between the band's inception to the eventual recording of their debut record. Here, Cale gives a rare lead vocal, with an enchantingly medieval aura, as well as some folksy guitar plucking. While Reed's elegiac poetry is largely intact here, it shares little else in common with the symphony of sadomasochistic ecstasy it would later become. It's a favorite amongst fans and the band itself. Morrison said it was perhaps his favorite of their songs, the closest we ever came in my mind to being exactly what I thought we could be. Cale agreed, saying, "It wasn't until then that I thought we had discovered a really original, nasty style."
Shiny, shiny leather in the dark, tongue the thongs, the belt that does await you. Strike, dear master, cure my heart.
Venus in Furs is directly inspired by sadomasochism. It's actually a direct cop of Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's, whose name we take for masochism, 1870 novel of the same name. Sacher-Masoch's tale is based heavily off his own life, revolving around a man who becomes a woman's sex slave, drowning himself in a world of sexual divination. Joe Harvard, in his 33 1/3 overview of the album, notes the psychological and artistic similarities between Sacher-Masoch and Reed. Both drew heavily from their own lived experience and fused what they knew about the world into a larger and more metaphysically romanticized narrative, blurring fiction and reality into one. Reed again injects his literary influences with the thumping sexuality of rock and roll, producing highly provocative and scandalous imagery that intrigues and stokes your imagination into a dense fog. Perhaps his most overtly poetic lyricism on the record, Reed describes the ecstasy of Severin, the protagonist, as he bends his knee to the mistress as she whips him to tears. The music is as disturbing and transfixing as Reed's lyrics, pairing perfectly with this tale of sexual fantasy.
Severin, Severin, speak so slightly. Severin, down on your bended knee. Taste the whip, in love not given lightly. Taste the whip, now plead for me.
Maybe the Velvet's greatest sonic accomplishment here. there is still little else that sounds like Venus in Furs. Cale plays a rapid glissando mimicking the cracking of a whip, slashing its victim into a frenzy of pain and pleasure. He again utilizes his avant-garde drone, perhaps to its ultimate effect. The result is equal parts seductive and frightening, enhancing this story of ultimate deviant sexual enlightenment. Tucker's drumming is her most primitive yet, a lone constant beat alongside the song's drip feed of torture, agonizingly slow as she pumps out a basic beat. The bass line is subtle but essential, which in this case was supplied by Sterling Morrison, something he begrudgingly did on the occasion it was needed. Like Moe's drumming, it's slow, elementary, but oozing with an indescribable perverted lust as it scales up and down at a glacial pace. The song's chorus is even more discordant. Cale drags his viola into an even more unpleasant droning, shocking you from your slumber. The Velvet Symphony envelops you into their devious nightmare, gripping you tight.
I am tired, I am weary, I could sleep for 1,000 years, 1,000 dreams that would awake me, different colors made of tears.
The climax finishes the song with an incredible release. Cale launches into an absolutely nasty cacophony. Reed's intense strumming that crosses along with Cale's is absolutely electrifying, finishing the song off with an unparalleled feeling of euphoria. It's easy to see why this was a favorite amongst the group. It's the perfect encapsulation of the strangely successful unification of avant-garde, rock and roll, and literature that they aimed for, and is easily a high point in their discography. Run, Run, Run feels like back to basics after Venus in Furs' avant-garde misery. Supposedly, Reed wrote this in the car on the way to a gig because the band didn't have enough material for their set. This is one of the roughest sounding songs on the record, possibly an example of the sonic restraints of their limited studio time. Reed's vocals sound more muffled than usual, and he belts them out with a desperate howl filled with urgency. The song has a particular swinging and more traditional feel, echoing their blues and R&B influence. Morrison's rhythm guitar is the glue, as Tucker slams through with abandon. They both sound as if they were recorded through a tin can, suffocating under such muck that you're jolted when Reed's piercing lead guitar jumps in, which is especially alarming in stereo, where the rhythm and lead are on separate channels. Reed's almost incomprehensible playing here is reminiscent of the free jazz he long admired. He spots off a series of maddening screeches that lift the song up from a simple garage rock tune into a frightening contortion of electric energy. His lyrics are again focusing on drug use, although he takes a more poetic and less direct approach here. He now speaks in third person, following 4 distinct characters, all addicts at varying low points of their lives. Reed implies that all these characters are overdosing or close to it, the chorus echoing at the end of each protagonist's conclusion.
C6 Sarah had a golden nose, hobnail boots wrapped around her toes. When she turned blue, all the angels screamed. They didn't know, they couldn't make her sing. She had a run, 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 take a dagger too. Run, 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 gypsy death they knew. Tell you what to do.
There's some obvious religious allusions, too, something Reed often employed, extolling how each character has sold their souls for a quick fix, and are now either trying to run from death or embracing the heaven experience of their final high. These characters also resemble the lives of many of those who surrounded the band in Warhol's scene of misfits. Some of them eventually lost their lives to drug addiction, like Warhol superstar Jackie Curtis, again blurring the line between Reed's reality and the fictional worlds he envisioned. Run, Run, Run is another harrowing tale of attrition, told with the punk-edged fierceness that the Velvets excelled at. All Tomorrow's Parties sounds like little else from 1967. It's still one of their strangest and most innovative tracks, and stands out even compared to the other songs on the record. It's mainly centered around Cale's mesmerizing piano loop, Reed's directionless lead guitar, and of course Nico's deadpan, depressive vocal stylings, although let's not forget Moe's bombastic drumming, which kicks off the record with grandiosity. That was John Cale's arrangement, Reed stated in 1971 in an interview with Metropolitan Review. The original song was very folky. He made it very grand and gothic, and then of course Nico's vocal changed it around a lot. Warhol called this one of his favorite Velvet songs, which makes sense considering the subject matter. Nico portrays a snapshot of a poor girl who cycles through a week-long chain of sadness and displeasure, represented by her obsession with the costumes and silk and linen gowns that she wears to All Tomorrow's Parties. The lyrical structure seems vaguely based on Monday's Child, a popular nursery rhyme intended to teach children the days of the week, mimicking its use of weekdays as abstract metaphors.
And what will she do with Thursday's rags when Monday comes around? She turned once more to Sunday's cloud and cry behind the door.
In the nursery rhyme, days are meant to represent a child's future, predicting their fate based on what day they were born. All Tomorrow's Parties adapts this idea, relating the days of the week with the endless cycle of misery that awaits the girl as the week goes on, destined to repeat each week the same way. Nico's vocals certainly added to the sense of sorrow. She had a particular knack for affixing a song with a sense of melancholy. Morrison put it bluntly, as for the haunting quality in her voice, it's not because she's singing to Bob Dylan or Lou Reed. Nico was just really depressed. Reed again channels a different style of lyricism, foregoing the matter-of-fact interpretation of events, like in Waiting for the Man, for metaphorical abstraction. The music itself is an abstraction as well. Cale centers the track around a relentless piano tone cluster, fixating on the monotony of repetition that eventually devolves into a subconscious drone. This is a technique Cale employs on much of the record, from the soft backing drone on Sunday Morning to the thumping groove of I'm Waiting for the Man. Cale's experimentation on All Tomorrow's Parties is another evolution of his avant-garde work with Lamont Young. This is also one of the few songs that definitely used Reed's ostrich tuning, which is sometimes misattributed to other Velvet Underground songs. The ostrich tuning wasn't really practical for too many compositions, but this is one instance where it worked out. It sounds alien, this tunelessly beautiful improvisation, contrasting Cale's underlying monotony, pitting heads at one another into a strange harmony. All Tomorrow's Parties is often rumored to have been inspired by The Factory and the various models, film stars, and burnouts that would cycle in and out. This may be incorrect, however, since the earliest recording is on the Ludlow Street demos from July of 1965, several months before they were said to have met Warhol or stepped foot in the factory. Cale has said the song was inspired by a woman named Daryl, someone he and Reed knew in the early days of the band, whom they competed over romantically. Cale has also claimed Reed wrote the song for Nico, although she said it was inspired by Edie Sedgwick. Nevertheless, the song's inspiration seems to be abstractly nebulous as the song itself. For some reason, it was chosen as one of the record's singles, backed by I'll Be Your Mirror, and cut down to a tight 3 minutes, but just like Sunday Morning, it didn't chart. It wasn't pro or con, it was just about taking heroin from the point of view of someone taking it. This is the centerpiece of the Velvet Underground and Nico, the song that solidifies their place in American music history, perhaps the best example of their unique ability to grab hold of your subconscious. Heroin starts in a humble and vulnerable state, balancing between two simple chords. Reed creeps in with a tenderness he's not yet displayed, establishing himself as a helpless figure lost in the world. Cale's viola works as a constant, sustained, but subdued drone, serving as the track's subconscious flatline. As the music speeds up, so does Reed, as he rapid-fires through his character's feelings of contempt and desperation. The idea here was to mimic the rise and fall of a heroin rush, As the drug affects the protagonist, sending them into ecstasy, the song speeds up and becomes more intense and fractured. Reed noted that as the verses go on, there are more lyrics to get through, which naturally makes you want to sing the song faster and faster.
I don't know just where I'm going, but I'm gonna try for the kingdom if I can, 'cause it makes me feel like I'm a man when I put a spike into my vein. And I tell you, things aren't quite the same when I'm rushing on my run, and I feel just like Jesus' son. And I guess that I just don't know, and I guess that I just don't know.
Everything intensifies, uplifting to an eventual crescendo of explosive sound, emulating the euphoric release Heroin offers. Cale unleashes an onslaught from his amplified viola, turning its subtle drone into a violent, blood-curdling shriek, rising higher, faster, and more destructive. Morrison's rhythm guitar strums along, growing louder and more aggressive. Tucker lashes onto her drums, seemingly unable to keep up with the chaos, smashing into the oblivion that surrounds her. Heroin altogether is an intensely emotional song, and one that has fittingly adopted an infamous and complicated legacy for the Velvet Underground. It helped to establish their sensationalized stereotype as heroin addicts, despite that not really being the case. We used to play the Whiskey A Go-Go all the time, so how gloomy could we have been? Because we sang heroin, people assumed we were junkies, says Tucker. Because we played Venus in Furs, they thought we beat each other. There were no smackheads in the band. Critics accused them of romanticizing the drug, contributing to their inability to get radio play. Bob Fass, one of the only DJs in the city to play their music, according to Sterling Morrison, explained why the band were seemingly radio outcasts. You always wondered why people were surprised, given the material on this record. Of course they wouldn't play it. I mean, we were still dealing with radio personalities who would listen to a song like Paint It Black by the Rolling Stones and call it Turkish wedding music. It wasn't just because of the contents, but also the musical sophistication, which was way beyond anything that pop radio would have countenanced. Reed particularly expressed irritation with the legacy the song garnered, which haunted him for years after the album's release. He claimed people would sometimes tell him they'd started taking the drug after hearing the song, which made it difficult for him to perform occasionally. It also seemed to be somewhat of a burden for him as a songwriter at times. In 1998, he said, "In some ways, it makes it a little hard for me now, because I've done that. I can't write Venus in Furs Part 2 or Heroin Part 2. Nevertheless, Heroin remains one of their greatest moments, and a real turning point in pop music, although it also caused controversy within the band. Tucker, for instance, was unsatisfied with her performance on the recorded version, although she's also praised it as one of their major accomplishments. Heroin drives me nuts. It's a pile of garbage on the record. The guys plugged straight into the board. They didn't have their amps up loud in the studio, so of course I couldn't hear anything. And when we got to the part where you speed up, you gotta speed up together, or it's not really right. And it just became this mountain of drum noise in front of me. I couldn't hear shit. I couldn't see Lou, to watch his mouth to see where he was in the song. And I just stopped. I was saying, this is no good, this isn't gonna work, we need phones or something. So I stopped, and being a little wacky, they just kept going. And that's the one we took." Cale and Reed clashed over the lyrics, after Reed suddenly changed the opening line from, "I know where I'm going," to its final, "I don't know just where I'm going." "You fucked up the whole song by changing the premise," I told him. "The song is not about drug taking, it's about a person who hates himself, and the reason he hates himself is not clear to anybody, because there's this conviction in the first-person line, and you don't question it after that. It makes the song much more powerful and gives it more drive. When you say, 'I don't know where I'm going,' it gives the game away in the first line." What Cale says here about the track not being about drug taking is key to its emotional impact. Its appeal is not just in the direct first-person account on display, but also its deep personal introspection. Cale said it was about the desire for something you can't describe. This is about a guy who is jumping towards God or the perfection of Jesus. There's a ferocious desire within the song to solve a problem. Morrison also acknowledged this by saying it was about spiritual death. Reed's genius is in using this personal tale of drug addiction as a metaphor, a universal detailing of the human condition and one's inability to overcome their struggles. Reed's character is unable to handle the world around them, and thus relies on heroin as a coping mechanism, to keep them sedated and ultimately unaware of the evils they refuse or are unable to confront. Their isolation, futility, and helplessness are themes that are easy to find some identity in. At the time I wrote Heroin and Sister Ray, I felt like a rather negative, strung-out, violent, aggressive person. I meant those songs to sort of exorcise the darkness, or the self-destructive element in me, and hoped that other people were responding to them. It was disturbing. I don't think like that anymore.
Heroin, be the death of me. It's my wife, and it's my life, because a mana to my vein leads to a center in my head, and then I'm better off than dead.
It's an absolute creative peak of self-destruction and ultimately acceptance. Few rock songs have reached quite the high point that Heroin does. And of course, it's in the running for the Velvet's most artistically significant and impactful of their career. It's possibly the first rock song about the drug that isn't overtly moralistic about drug use or covered by euphemism. Reed speaks directly about the experience of shooting up, at a time when drug use was more commonly alluded to or implied in pop music. In an era when Vice President Spiro Agnew lobbied to have With a Little Help from My Friends banned due to his belief of its allusions to drug use, it's easy to see something like Heroin as a daring step, although to Reed, this idea was as obvious as any. I'd been reading Burroughs and Ginsberg and Selby. I was a big fan of certain kinds of writing. I had a BA in English, so why wouldn't I? It seemed obvious, and it still does. There was a huge uncharted world there. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world to do. That's the kind of thing you might read. Why wouldn't you listen to it? There She Goes Again is the most conventional rock song on the album, a palate cleanser after the devastation of Heroin. Reed is back to his rock and roll bravado, supplemented by a familiar guitar riff, which was lifted from Marvin Gaye's 1962 hit, Hitchhike.
I've got to find that girl if I have to hitchhike round the world. Hitchhike.
The Velvet's appropriation of Hitchhike is interesting for a few reasons. For one, it's another direct glimpse of the band's roots, an obviously direct rip-off homage that's more straightforward than most of the record. The two songs are also centered around men with unhealthy relationships with women. Gaye's character has an innocently exaggerated desire to travel cross-country to find the lover he's been aching over.
I'm going to Chicago, that's the last place my baby stayed. Yeah, hitchhike. I'm packing up my bags, gonna leave this old town right away. Hitchhike. I've got to find that girl if I have to hitchhike round the world. Hitchhike.
Reed doesn't pull punches here. This is about a woman who has possibly turned to some form of prostitution or street life after leaving an abusive relationship. Another one of his gruesome portraits of the urban underbelly.
There she goes again. She's out on the streets again. She's down on her knees, my friend, but you know she'll never ask you please again. Now take a look, there's no tears in her eyes. She won't take it from just any guy. What can you do? You see her walking on down the street. Look at all your friends that she's gonna meet. You better hit her.
Reed even gives the song a violent edge, although in this context it feels sarcastic or ironic, even though Reed was sometimes physically abusive himself. The lyrics come off tongue-in-cheek then, a dark satirization of a culture where violence is seen as a legitimate way to end domestic disputes. Here, women exist to be put in their place by men, even if violent force is required. Reed's character is just as obsessive about his woman as Gay is about his, but Reed chooses to mix up some of the context in order to muddy up the story. There's no overt moral position, but what's being described speaks for itself, and I don't think it needed me to say anything about it. I don't take a superior view or any kind of elitist view towards any of these. There She Goes Again also displays the Velvets proving they were capable of playing their instruments like a real rock band if they cared enough to. Metronomically, we were a pretty accurate band. If we were speeding up or slowing down, it was by design. If you listen to the solo break on There She Goes Again, it slows down, slower and slower and slower. And then when it comes back into the Bye Bye Byes, it's double the original tempo. A tremendous leap to twice the speed. There She Goes Again is ultimately deceptively simple, serving as a prime example of the band's occasional no-nonsense approach to rock, contrasted with Reed's sly form of dark humor. The end product then becomes something familiar, but also new, ugly, and strange in the Velvet's own unique, twisted way. I'm always left with this bad taste in my mouth as the song fades away on its ironically upbeat outro.
Fly, fly away. See you walking on down the street. Look at all your friends that you're gonna meet. She's gonna ball shot, she's gonna work it. She's gonna work it.
Finally, here's a love song, and it doesn't even mention whips or chains. Also, this is a pretty groovy track for the Velvets, and the final vehicle for Nico to display her brief but memorable contribution to the band's sound. Supposedly, Reed and Nico shared a brief affair, and Reed wrote this tune for her after she once told him that she would be his mirror.
I be your mirror, reflect what you are, in case you don't know. I be the wind, the rain and the sunset, the light on your door, to show that you're home.
Nico sings from one lover to another, confiding to them that they can be a shoulder of comfort, a mirror to look into, to find the beauty they know lies within. It's an inspiring tale of love and its power to lift one out of even the deepest darkness. In his 1967 review, Timothy Jacobs called it no less than a love song in the midst of all the pain and misery of the rest of the album. I'll Be Your Mirror is powerful again in its subversion. Its soft encouragement is unexpectedly welcoming after the loneliness of Heroin and the cynical violence of There She Goes Again. Reed proves one more time that he has songs in him that can go beyond the dark and depressive.
Please put down your hands, 'cause I see you.
Ironically, this sweet tune was one of the most strenuous for Nico to record. Morrison claims that during the sessions, Nico used her full-register Germanic Götterdämmerung voice, which the band didn't care for. They made her do the vocals over and over, eventually driving her to tears before she decided she wanted to skip the track altogether. After reassuring her to try just one more time, Nico supplied the take that made it onto the record. Her performance is unusually sweet, contrasting her Ice Queen persona on Femme Fatale and All Tomorrow's Parties with a warm sensitivity she rarely ever displayed. Unfortunately, the love between Reed and Nico that inspired the tune didn't last. The relationship was brief, according to Cale, only a month or two before she swatted him like a fly. When it fell apart, we really learned how Nico could be the mistress of the destructive one-liner. One morning, we had gathered at the factory for a rehearsal. Nico came in late, as usual. Lou said hello to her in a rather cold way, but just hello. She simply stood there. You could see she was waiting to reply in her own time. Ages later, out of the blue, came her first words. I cannot make love to Jews anymore.
I be your mirror. I be your mirror.
Mainly centered around its continually strummed electric guitar, Cale's frenetic viola, and Reed's abstract lyrics, The Black Angel's Death Song is the Velvet's most Dylan-esque cut. Reed spitfires a series of rhythmic but unlinked verses with an uncharacteristic veracity. An odd but memorable addition is Cale's sharp hissing sound, which will surely shock you awake if I'll Be Your Mirror lulled you to sleep. Cale claims they initially tried to use maracas for this sound, but it wasn't quite right, so they went with his ear-piercing hiss. Cale also says Morrison refused to play bass on this one, since he resented having to do it on Venus in Furs, so he had to overdub it later on. The main idea here was less to provide lyrics that made sense, and more to string words together for the sheer fun of their sound, not any particular meaning.
Now the ghost bloody country all covered with sleep, where the black angel did weep, not on no city street and he's gone to choose.
Reed throws out his more concise journalistic storytelling for a poetically ambiguous flavor. This is possibly reflective of his college mentor, Delmore Schwartz, who Reed consistently praised as a major influence on him as a writer. There's also a bit of his beatnik DNA too. Reed's rapid-fire release of surreal imagery and wordplay is reflective of Jack Kerouac's use of spontaneous prose, a technique where you allow yourself to write or speak your words out rapidly, in an effort to allow ideas to flow through your writing freely, effectively removing yourself from intentional editing or censorship. The effect works well here. The Black Angel's Death Song feels like a feverish dream, with a variety of metaphorical scenes, allowing you to choose their meaning and purpose, another instance of Reed flexing his literary muscle to explore different waters. The Velvets will switch things up one final time, following a track designed around wordplay experimentation with their most lyrically sparse song of all. You can write, and if you sell out and there's a heaven from which you can be haunted, I'll haunt you. Reed recalls these words from his Syracuse University professor, Delmore Schwartz, whom European Son was dedicated to. Schwartz, who was indeed the son of European immigrants, was a highly praised writer, an early mentor for Reed, who also happened to hate rock lyrics. It's thought that the Velvets cheekily dedicated this song to Schwartz since it had the fewest lyrics of any of the tracks on the album, and thus had the best chance of pleasing him. Later in his life, Schwartz struggled with alcoholism and mental illness. He fell into intense paranoia, and refused to see Reed and Morrison in the months leading up to his death. Morrison even claimed he thought the duo were spies sent on behalf of Norman Rockefeller in a conspiracy to kill him. Schwartz died in July of 1966, only a few months after the song was recorded.
You killed your European son. You spit on those under 21. But now your blue cards are gone. You better sit so long. Hey, hey, bye, bye, bye.
The final track on the album kicks off simple enough. Cale's bass line is pulsing but restrained. Reed rattles off his venomous lyrics, and Morrison and Tucker provide a tight rhythm. Soon, though, everything will break down into varying degrees of intolerable chaos. The infamous glass shatter is the true finale of the record. The next 6 minutes is simply the frantic cacophonous coda to remind you that the Velvets are here to disrupt and displease. European Son is the final step in the Velvet Underground's attempt to unite their avant-garde and free jazz influences with the frenetic backbeat of rock music. They break and beat this idea down to its primary elements into several layers of abstraction, to the point where it no longer resembles much of anything at all. Each band member pushes their instruments as far as they know how to, melding into one another, to become what effectively is one final communal drone. European Son is an impressive feat, being the most hostile and unwelcoming track on a record full of orally excruciating moments. It's the final fuck you the Velvets have to offer, challenging you to pick up the needle at any point during its 7-minute freakout, until it suddenly ends, putting you out of your misery. It's the perfect finish to the Velvets' debut, an apocalyptic destruction of rock and roll, and one of the finest finales in modern music. The Velvets admit they have nothing left to say, and instead simply offer one more sonic onslaught. As Warhol said, always leave them wanting less. For outlandish originality, I think it's untouched. That's the album I thought would never exist. I don't think anybody would ever let us make a record, so we made it ourselves. Then I never thought anybody would ever release it. It got released. Then I never thought anybody would buy it, but they did. The Velvet Underground Nico released in March of 1967, almost a year after its recording. The reasons for the record's delay are still not entirely known. It might have been from technical setbacks due to its complicatedly irregular and expensive peelable front cover. Some think it was to not interfere with Verve's other Avant-Garde debut, The Mothers of Invention's Freakout. Either way, the release was largely seen as a disappointment by all involved. Of course, the commercial failure of the Banana album is almost as infamous now as the music itself. Brian Eno, a longtime Velvet admirer, is cited with the most famous statement on the Velvet's commercial defeat. I was talking to Lou Reed the other day, and he said that the first Velvet Underground sold only 30,000 copies in its first 5 years. Yet that was an enormously important record for so many people. I think everyone who bought one of those 30,000 copies started a band. This estimate might be a bit off, actually. Although Verve never publicly shared sales numbers, there is evidence of an MGM royalty check showing about 60,000 copies sold through February of 1969, which isn't too shabby for a debut. Certainly, it received a decent amount of attention for its attachment to Andy Warhol, although this might have been a double-edged sword. Much of the marketing, of which there was seldom, was centered around Warhol, furthering the idea that he had more to do with the music than he actually did. Nevertheless, the release of the album was heavily anticipated by the band after the long wait. Tucker ran out immediately to buy her copy, and Morrison said he obsessively called music trade magazine Cashbox to see the record's updated chart performance, which reportedly went as high as 102. None of the album's singles charted, however, and many radio stations flat out refused to play the band's music due to the taboo nature of their subject material and their oppressively strange music. Whatever commercial success they might have had, though, was ultimately cut short, due to an event which Morrison referred to as the crowning moment of doom. Eric Emerson, a factory regular and future member of the band The Magic Tramps, sued Verve for using a photo of him on the album's sleeve without his consent. Emerson, who might have just been looking for a quick cash-out, forced Verve to recall the album, which made them eventually airbrush him out. This, of course, killed the album's momentum and locked it into its temporary obscurity. It didn't help how competitive 1967 was for rock music.
Know that it will be untrue.
The Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, Pink Floyd, The Doors, and so many others all released highly acclaimed and forward-thinking music that soaked up most of the limelight. Critics largely avoided the record on release too, and the ones that did review it seemed to have somewhat mixed reactions. Richard Goldstein's Village Voice review complained that some of the material is dull and repetitive, and the last 2 cuts are pretentious to the point of misery. Timothy Jacobs gave the record one of its most involved reviews for Vibrations, finishing by saying, "A good first album for this group, although in the future we hope that other efforts will not be quite as negative." At this point it seemed the Velvets had little hope in reaching a wider audience anytime soon, and the inner turmoil would only increase from here on out. A few months after the record's release, Nico would leave the band for good. According to Morrison, there would often be long stretches where the band would simply refuse to play live, and since Nico needed money and still had grand ambitions in the music business, she decided to go off on her own. In May, however, the Velvets arrived in Boston to play their first show at the Boston Tea Party. Nico decided last minute to fly out from New York with Warhol and Paul Morrissey to play with the group. Morrison claims she showed up towards the end of their set, and since they'd already played all the songs she usually sang, they didn't let her up to perform. This only increased the rift between Nico and the band, and eventually in her permanent absence. After all, it was just my backing band. I left it and it fell apart. That's the story you could put about it. That will do just as well as the stories I read about it now. They are all incredible. You could say they were a group of aliens who landed in order to entertain all the other aliens in the world. That would explain the record sales, at least.
Here's room 506. It's enough to make you sick. Bridget's all wrapped up in foil. You wonder if she can uncoil.
Nico then pursued a solo career. She released her debut album Chelsea Girls only a few months after the Velvet Underground and Nico in October, produced by Tom Wilson. It featured musical and songwriting contributions from Reed, Cale, and Morrison, and still today serves as an interesting companion to the Velvet's debut. Unfortunately, it was a colossal disappointment for Nico. The choice to replace drums and guitar with strings and flute ruined it for her, saying she cried upon hearing how far the album was from what she intended it to be. I do wonder what might have become of the Velvet Underground and Nico if the Velvets didn't have as much control over production as they did. Perhaps Venus and Furs might have turned into a pleasing Baroque piece instead, and the record might have forever faded into irrelevancy. After Chelsea Girls, Nico would release several albums, produced by Cale, which, like everything else, released to lukewarm sales and reception before garnering a cult following and acclaim years later. She also struggled with a heroin addiction and was often difficult to work with and be around. Danny Fields, a rock journalist who knew the Velvets in their early days and had a heavy hand in sparking punk rock in the 70s, once described her as Nazi-esque, and that she was sometimes anti-Semitic to him. One particularly nasty story occurred in 1971, when Nico slashed actress and singer Emeretta Marx in the face. Nico may have been triggered by Marx discussing her experience with racial oppression, to which Nico responded violently, saying something along the lines of, "You don't know what suffering is," or even possibly something more racially charged like, "I hate black people." In 1988, Nico died of a brain hemorrhage while on vacation with her son Ari.
Here they come now, Chelsea girls.
Between the disillusion of the EPI, the torturous wait for the record's release, and its poor reception, the relationship between the band and Warhol and Morrissey was suffering. Warhol met with Reed to ask him what he wanted of the band's future. "Do you want to keep just playing museums from now on and the art festivals? Or do you want to start moving into other areas? Don't you think you should think about it?" So I thought about it and I fired him. He was furious. I'd never seen Andy angry, but I did that day. He was really mad, called me a rat. That was the worst thing he could think of. Paul Morrissey recalls being relieved at this disillusion, and noted how difficult it was to work with Reed. Lou wanted to end the management contract before any hoped-for record royalties came in. Lou immediately did so by disbanding the group. He told us they weren't going to play anymore, and he asked for a release from their contract. But Andy especially, as well as myself, we were glad to get rid of them. Andy was relieved just to walk away. Andy and Reed's relationship remained somewhat strained until Warhol's death in 1987. When Valerie Solanas shot Warhol in 1968, he seemed hurt that Reed never visited him in the hospital. Warhol's death, 20 years after the Velvet's debut, did lead to the reunion between Reed and Cale with their ambitious Warhol retrospective, Songs for Drella. While Warhol's impact on the Velvets is sometimes over-exaggerated, in hindsight, his involvement was seen by the band with some form of reverence. Without his financial backing and creative encouragement, there very well might have never been any Velvet Underground albums to begin with. It sounds crazy, but on reflection, I've decided that he was never wrong. He gave us the confidence to keep doing what we were doing. Today, the Velvet's failure to find commercial success is a large part of their enduring legacy. For many, they were the ultimate band ahead of their time, undervalued and disregarded by the mainstream establishment of their day, only to eventually outlast most of their contemporaries as more and more acolytes saw the light of their vision. Ellen Willis called them the first important rock and roll artists who had no real chance of attracting a mass audience. Of course, over time, the Velvets would eventually reach that mass audience and garner the attention they couldn't seem to find in 1967. Over the decades since its release, new generations of aspiring artists have stumbled upon and mined new ideas from it, continuing and growing its legacy as a proto-punk pioneer, helping to birth new forms of artistic expression. Eventually, it went from a kitschy Warhol oddity to an all-time American rock legend that could hold its own against any other top album in popular music. In the 90s, Reed reflected, "When the Velvet Underground first came out with songs like Heroin, we were so savaged for it. Here it is a few decades later, and I have those lyrics published in a book, and I'm giving readings at art museums. We wanted to make records that would stick around like great novels or movies, and we believed in what we were doing, even if nobody else did." The Velvet Underground and Nico was an important step for the idea that rock music could be more than a commercial investment. It helped to solidify that a rock band could push boundaries, explore and experiment with new sounds, incorporate taboo subjects into rock lyrics without trivialization, and forge the way for a world of alternative music to exist outside the confines of popularity, commercial expectations, or market trends. The Velvets proved that a rock band did not necessarily need to live or die by its chart performance, but by the vitality of their artistic worth. Its legacy has proven to be long-lasting, inspiring countless alternative and punk rock movements, providing a blueprint for artists to launch from. Patti Smith, Talking Heads, Blondie, The Strokes, even Mick Jagger has cited the Velvets as an influence. A number of future rockers experienced them live and were forever changed, including Robert Quinn of the Voidoids, who would later play with Reed, Rick Ocasek of the Cars, and Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders. David Bowie, perhaps the most famous Velvet devotee, was lucky enough to listen to the record before its release, after his manager secured an early pressing. Everything I both felt and didn't know about rock music was open to me. It didn't care if I liked it or not. This was a degree of cool that I had no idea was humanly sustainable, and it was ravishing. Even now, the album continues its legacy for future generations. In 2021, a cover album of its songs was released, featuring admirers young and old, from Michael Stipe and Iggy Pop to St. Vincent and Courtney Barnett. Of course, I'm also evidence of the band's lingering influence. I didn't hear the record until almost 50 years after its release, and it still left such a profound impact on me that I've been obsessive over it ever since. For me, it was instantly a revelation that changed how I would engage with music and art from then on out. It's helped me make sure I remain open-minded to new ideas that may seem abrasive or abnormal, and has honestly twisted me around so much that to this day, it continues to make me question what good art even means to me. I'd never experienced something that was so loud, dissonant, unapproachable, pretentious, but also beautiful, self-conscious, intimate, and freeing. Despite everything I have to say about the record, though, it still feels almost impossible to fully articulate why this music in particular is so important to me. Forget all the talk of cultural impact or historical significance, it's just the music here itself that keeps me coming back. There's still that special connection somewhere deep in my mind that makes it tough to fully explain. There's something inexplicable in these songs that pierces me in a particular way that not much else does. For all I can think to add, John Cale still says it best. The aim of the band on the whole was to hypnotize audiences so that their subconscious would take over. I think it worked, because people who tell you they love the band are never able to tell you why.